Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. As the weather warms and the pastures turn green, cattle turnout comes into sight. This special edition episode brings together key insights, tips, and strategies from multiple past episodes into one must-listen edition. Whether you're a new producer or a seasoned rancher, this episode is packed with practical advice to help you achieve a smooth and successful grazing season. We kick things off with episode 72, Cracking the Code on Grazing Management Terminology, Animal Units, AUMS, and how to apply them.
Does it feel like grazing management information is shrouded in acronyms and terms that boggle the mind on first glance? Do you struggle to decipher terms like animal unit equivalents? And how does one go about calculating AUMs and then applying those numbers? Be reassured, you're not alone. There's a lot going on when sorting through the finer points of grazing management and figuring out how to work through the many calculations. A good starting point is defining a grazing animal in terms of how much forage it requires to meet its nutritional demands. We know that grazing animals' forage needs differ. Depending on class, weight, age, and stage of production, and in order to account for those differences, it's helpful to create a baseline in order to quantify forage demand. An animal unit, AU, is defined as a 1,000-pound beef cow with or without a nursing calf, with a daily dry matter forage requirement of 26 pounds. By standardizing grazing animals at 1,000 pounds as one animal unit AU, we are able to use that as a basis for calculating the relative grazing impact of different kinds and classes of livestock. We can work off of one AU to adjust for other animal types. Use the Calculating Forage Requirements chart to find the animal unit equivalent, AUE, that best defines your grazing animals, which you can find in the show notes. For example, yearlings ranging from 800 to 900 pounds are considered equivalent to 0.85 animal units, AUs, while a 1,400-pound cow with calf at side is considered to be 1.3 AUs. Essentially, the larger the animal and the greater their nutritional requirements, the higher the animal unit equivalent value. With a clear picture in mind of an animal unit and its equivalents, the leap to quantifying forage demand with measures such as animal unit days, AUDs, or animal unit months, AUMs, is not difficult. If one AU requires 26 pounds of forage dry matter per day, we can then easily extrapolate to calculate the needs of any animal for a longer period of time. An animal unit month, AUM, is the amount of forage to fulfill metabolic requirements of one animal unit for 1 month, 30 days. Therefore, one AUM is equal to 780 pounds of dry matter forage, 26 pounds per day times 30 days. Think of an AUM as the amount of forage that you need to provide to an animal to maintain them for 1 month. But remember, that animal weighs only 1,000 pounds. Anything more or less has to be accounted for by using animal unit equivalents, AUEs. Once you are comfortable with these standardized units, they become very useful tools to strategize and plan for various grazing options. Consider the following scenarios as examples of how you might use animal unit equivalents to begin the groundwork for grazing management strategies on paper before applying them in real time. Scenario 1. A herd of 150 cow-calf pairs averaging 1,400 pounds, 1.3 animal unit equivalent, equals 195 animal units, or 150 pairs times 1.3 AUE equals 195 AUs. Scenario 2. A group of 150 yearlings weighing an average of 850 pounds, or 0.85 animal unit equivalent, equates to 128 animal units, or 150 yearlings times 0.85 AUE equals 128 AUs. Scenario 3. If you want to graze that 150 pair cow herd, 195 AUs for 6 months, pasture acres must be available that can supply a total of 1,170 AUMs, or 195 AUs times 6 months equals 1,170 AUMs. And scenario 4. If grazing 150 yearlings, 128 AUs for 6 months, total forage demand is 768 AUMs, or 128 AUs times 6 months equals 768 AUMs. Calculating and understanding forage requirements allows us to be able to match that demand up with available forage supply. The BCRC Carrying Capacity Calculator helps with that. It walks users through estimating available forage to determine the number of head and length of time that animals can graze a specific pasture or paddock. Remember that these values are all approximations and averages. We are using numbers to estimate and standardize what happens in reality to guide informed decision-making for your operation. It is important to note that there are many factors at play when managing and balancing grazing demand and available forage supply. The real world always overrides what calculations attempt to predict, but they can provide a starting point for planning and forecasting. You've now got a few of the basics in hand to understand the foundations of the art and science of grazing management. It is this critical information that will assist as you navigate real-world situations like developing targeted grazing plans, implementing rest periods, or managing through drought and recovery.
Episode 59. How to calculate carrying capacity.
Carrying capacity, often referred to as grazing capacity, is the amount of forage available for grazing animals in a particular pasture or field. Accurately calculating this capacity is crucial for determining an appropriate stocking rate. This helps maintain productivity for both your animals and forage, while also ensuring the sustained health of the grassland resources. One method to determine carrying capacity is by reviewing past stocking rates and grazing management information, then assessing the condition of the pasture. But what if historical stocking rate data is unavailable, or you are uncertain about its accuracy and reliability? Carry capacity could also be calculated based on how much forage is in the field, but this can change over the grazing season or year to year. Carrying capacity can be calculated using various techniques. All of these methods involve some trial and error, as they must be monitored and adjusted over time. When calculating carrying capacity, you should consider 3 questions. How much forage is available? How much of that forage can be used by grazing animals? How many animals can graze on that piece of land, and for how long? The BCRC Carrying Capacity Calculator provides a roadmap for answering these questions using 2 separate methods. Method number 1, forage estimates based on provincial guides, and method number 2, field-based sampling, also known as the clip and weigh method. In this podcast, we will review the 4 steps involved in each of these 2 methods. Method 1, using provincial guides. This method relies on provincial forage production guides and is particularly user-friendly and effective when the pasture condition, or range health, is consistent throughout the field and the forage plant community is uniform. This method involved 4 steps. Step 1, determine pasture conditions. For tame pastures, pasture condition class definitions provide general descriptions for classifying tame pastures as excellent, good, fair, or poor. For excellent yields, 75 to 100% of the potential is achieved, with 95% desirable grass and legumes, less than 5% weeds, and an average to above average fertility program. Good yields achieve 60 to 75% of potential, with 90% desirable grass, less than 10% weeds, and an average fertility program. Fair yields reach 50 to 60% of potential, with 60% desirable grass, 20% or more weeds, and a below-average or non-existent fertility program. Poor yields result in 33 to 50% of potential, with less than 50% desirable grass, 50% or more weeds, and no fertility program. Step 2, estimate forage yield. Once the pasture condition classification has been determined, forage yield can be estimated based on that information and the precipitation zone for the location. For example, if pasture condition is good and precipitation of the zone is at 14 to 18 inches, the estimated forage yield is 740 pounds per acre. This is based on Alberta tame pasture data and may not be applicable to rangeland or other provinces. Higher carrying capacities can be achieved with fertility programs or intensive grazing. Specific provincial guides should be used to assess forage yield and stocking rates for your specific soil zone or eco-site. Some of the various guides are linked in the show notes. Step 3, calculate available forage. Once forage yield has been estimated, we need to determine the appropriate utilization rate for grazing. The utilization rate determines how much forage material should be left behind to maintain future production. Overutilizing pasture can damage plant recovery, reducing forage productivity and allowing less palatable plants to take over. Recommended utilization rates for native pastures vary from 25 to 50%. For tame pastures, recommended utilization rates range from 50 to 75%, depending on fertility and rainfall. For calculating forage requirements, animal unit months, AUMS, are used. An animal unit, AU, represents the grazing impact of different livestock types. 1 AU is defined as a 1,000-pound beef cow with or without a nursing calf, with a daily dry matter forage requirement of 26 pounds. An animal unit month refers to the amount of forage needed to meet the metabolic requirements of one animal unit for 30 days. 1 AUM is equivalent to 780 pounds of dry matter forage. To calculate the total forage available in a grazing area, pasture size is essential. For example, if a pasture is 160 acres, with an estimated forage yield of 740 pounds per acre and a 50% utilization rate, the total available forage for grazing is estimated at 59,200 pounds. From this, the calculator determines that the pasture can support approximately 76 AUMs, or 2,277 animal unit days of grazing. Step 4. Calculate the number of animals that can graze. Different classes or sizes of cattle consume different amounts of forage. For example, a yearling steer is equivalent to 0.85 AUs, while a 1,300-pound cow with calf at side is estimated at 1.3 AUs. In Step 4, we need to know the average weight of the grazing animals to determine and enter their equivalent AUs. If we would like to know how many cow-calf pairs could graze a specific field for 1 month, we would simply divide the number of annual unit months, calculated in Step 3 by the animal units for a cow-calf pair, estimated at 1.3. Following these 4 steps, one is able to calculate an estimated carrying capacity without stepping foot on the pasture. However, it should be mentioned that the data for this method is currently only available for Western Canada. When forage yield data becomes available for Eastern regions, the BCRC Carrying Capacity Calculator Method 1 will be updated. As mentioned, there are many ways to calculate carrying capacity. The second method we will review is Method 2, Field-Based Sampling. This is also known as the clip and weight method, and as the name suggests, requires more hands-on labor. Producers may choose field-based sampling if provincial guides are unavailable for their region, or if pasture types or conditions vary within their field. Like Method 1, there are 4 steps. Step 1, Sampling. Samples are collected by clipping all forage close to the ground within an area of 50 by 50 centimeters, 0.25 square meter. The choice area should be representative of the pasture that has not been grazed. It's best to clip during the grazing season, building up data for a number of years to get a picture of the average forage yield that is representative across varying weather conditions. The number of samples taken will vary with the size of the field and how uniform or varied the forage production is within the field. The goal is to take enough samples to capture the variation in the pasture in order to be representative. Step 2, dry the forage samples using a food dehydrator or in an oven at 100 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 1 day, or dry at room temperature over several days. No matter what technique used for drying, make sure to keep the samples contained and identified. Once dry, weigh each sample and record the total dry forage in grams. Sorting the litter from the green material is optional. This step will give more information and be more accurate compared to using total dry forage weight, but is a time-consuming process. It is important to balance accuracy with time availability. If a producer doesn't have the time to do it or can't commit to it on a consistent basis, then it may not be worth the effort. Weights can be entered into the BCRC Carrying Capacity Calculator, Method 2 in grams. Recording the green material weight is optional only if you went through the sorting process and collected that data. Step 3. Calculate the available forage. The BCRC calculator converts average dry forage weight from grams per 0.25 square meter to pounds per acre for estimated forage supply. For example, the average dry forage weight of 52 grams per 0.25 square meter is converted to 1,851 pounds per acre. Enter your chosen utilization rate and the pasture size to calculate total forage available in the pasture and then number of animal unit months. Step 4. Calculate the number of animals that can graze. Use the average weight of the grazing animals to determine and enter their equivalent animal units in Step 4 to calculate the number of cattle that can graze on that piece of land. As mentioned in Method 1, Step 4, if we would like to know how many cow-calf pairs could graze a specific field for 1 month, we would simply divide the number of annual unit months, calculated in Step 3, by the animal units for a cow-calf pair, estimated at 1.3. The two methods provided in the BCRC carrying capacity calculator are not the only ways to calculate carrying capacity, and they can provide more robust insight when combined with more detailed management information, for example, historic stocking rates, precipitation, range health monitoring. However, they are a great place to start. Calculating carrying capacity is the starting point to understand how to balance forage supply and demand. Effective grazing management supports forage yield, animal health, and productivity, all of which will impact cost of production. It also benefits the pasture ecosystem. For more resources about grazing management and how to develop a grazing plan, please explore the links in the show notes.
Episode 26, Optimizing Pasture Health, a practical guide to implementing take half, leave half grazing.
When making changes to your beef cattle operation, starting with simple, manageable steps is the key to long-lasting improvements. This is the case when it comes to the concept of take half, leave half, which is the basic rule of thumb for grazing management that can be effectively implemented in any region in good weather years and bad. In a recent video from the BCRC, Dr. Brianna Keln, adjunct professor at the University of Saskatchewan and a farmer/cow-calf producer north of Regina, demonstrated two methods to determine available forage and how to estimate when 50% has been utilized. Dr. Keln explains, leaving behind some green material is important to ensure that plant can still photosynthesize and take energy back into the roots so the pasture can persist and overwinter. The first method involves using height as a quick and easy strategy to estimate the forage volume available to graze. Simply measure the height of your desirable forage in approximately 20 different spots, record the average height, and then move cattle off that stand once that average height is cut in half. The second method uses weight, which is more labor-intensive but more accurate to assume when 50% of the plant material is utilized. This entails cutting a few samples of forage from the pasture as close to the ground as possible, binding the bottom with an elastic band, and then finding the middle point by balancing the sample on your finger until the forage rests even and straight. You will then cut off the top of that plant sample at the identified point of balance, which allows for a visual representation of what the growing plants will look like once 50% of the plant material, based on weight, has been utilized. Either of these methods are effective ways to begin to recognize what you are starting with and what 50% utilization actually looks like. When taking these pre-grazing measurements, be sure you are only including the portion of pasture that will be consumed by cattle. For example, if your pasture is half weeds and half forage, grazing the forage right down to the ground while the weeds remain untouched is not the take half, leave half principle. In this case, you would only consider the desirable forage portion of the pasture, which accounts, in this case, for 50% of plant mass, meaning that 25% of the total plant mass on the field will be utilized to effectively apply take half, leave half. Dr. Keln says, while take half, leave half can be used as a guide, the amount you graze really is determined by how long you're able to rest that plant. She adds that grazing 60, 70, or even 80% of top growth material can be okay as long as that pasture has time to regrow. The more you take off, the more time that pasture needs to rest. Not allowing the necessary time to regrow puts that stand at risk of being overgrazed. The University of Saskatchewan professor defines overgrazing as a function of time and not allowing pasture the time it needs to recuperate in order to be grazed again or survive the winter. If we take too much top plant and don't allow adequate time to rest while it's actively growing, then we are at risk of those plants dying off and having undesirable species coming into the pasture, as well as a productivity decline. Not allowing for adequate rest can also have animal health implications, such as increased parasite loads and unideal selection behaviors, which all impact the health and longevity of your pasture long term. Dr. Keln goes on to say that if producers want to implement a heavier, more intensive grazing regime and a plan to do so, that can be very successful. But she stresses that it's important to know what plants are out there, target them at the right time, and allow for that rest at the right time. Grazing a stand harder than intended in a pinch during a drought when forage is minimal is when things can get really messy. So before we leave here today, I wanted to go over some key considerations regarding the principle of take half, leave half. The first, only look and measure the main nutritive forage in that pasture stand. Do not include undesirable or anti-nutritional weeds or plant material. The second, take measurements before cattle are led onto that field, ideally immediately before introducing them to the new piece. Third, the more you graze, the more time that pasture needs to rest. And 4, knowing the plant species in your pasture can help you to strategically graze throughout the season. All to say, when it comes to grazing management, know what you have a plan, execute that plan to the best of your ability, and always have a plan B. And maybe even a plan C.
Episode 70, Developing a Grazing Plan.
Developing a grazing plan is an important first step to ensure effective grazing management on an operation, and it can help save a producer on their cost of production in the long run. A grazing plan that matches animal numbers to predicted forage yields is something that should be done prior to animal turnout. Within a grazing plan, there are several key steps that should be included. These include setting objectives and goals, resource inventory and evaluation, balancing forage supply and demand, cost benefit and risk assessment, implementation, monitoring, and finally, the plan update. Setting goals and objectives. A key step in developing a grazing plan is defining the goals and objectives for the entire grazing operation. This includes lifestyle choices such as how much time a producer may want to spend moving their livestock around each week, profitability measures, and biological outcomes such as forage production, soil health, animal performance, and ecosystem impacts, resource inventory, and evaluation. Completing an inventory and evaluating resources is crucial for developing and implementing a successful grazing system. This resource inventory can answer questions such as how much forage is available and at what times of the grazing season. Is the forage source able to meet the animal's required nutritional requirements? How long is the intended grazing season? What physical infrastructure is available or needed? How the forage supply and demand are balanced all ties back to the goals and objectives for the grazing management of that operation. Cost benefit and risk assessment. The cost benefit and risk assessment is the next step in developing a grazing plan. Effective grazing management on a pasture ensures high forage yield, sustainability, and animal health and productivity, all of which impact the cost of production. Completing a risk assessment in addition to looking at the cost benefits can help an operation improve its grazing management plan. Implementation. Implementation is the next stage in developing a grazing plan. There are several different grazing systems a producer may choose to implement due to variance in climate, plant species, soil, and livestock. These different grazing systems include, but are not limited to, rotational grazing, forward grazing, creep grazing, limit grazing, stockpile grazing, and extended grazing. Monitoring. After the grazing plan has been implemented, it is important to ensure the pasture is monitored to make sure the objectives and goals that the producer set up at the beginning of their grazing plan are met. Keeping accurate and up-to-date pasture records is vital to inform future grazing plans by providing information such as an accurate assessment of the carrying capacity of a pasture. Plan update. After monitoring the pasture, if the current plan did not meet the goals and objectives, it is important to consider updating the grazing plan to better aim for these goals next season. Grazing plans should be flexible to accommodate changing conditions, such as fluctuations in livestock numbers or drastic swings in precipitation.
Episode 34, Grazing cattle on cropland can be mutually beneficial.
When we hear stories of farms from previous generations, mixed operations are often the tradition, where people grow crops and had some cattle and other livestock as well. With economies of scale and farm size increasing, farms have generally become more specialized. However, recent rises in input costs and climate crises, such as drought, have many producers rethinking integrated farming operations. This may mean owning both cattle and cropland, but it could also mean working with neighbors. In some situations, beef producers have been working with their cropping neighbors to develop mutually beneficial deals where both parties can benefit from having cattle on cropland. Integrating cattle and cropland is not new, but there are many questions about how it can work on our current landscapes. Researchers at the University of Manitoba have teamed up in search of answers. Dr. Yvonne Lawley, Associate Professor in the Department of Plant Science, and Dr. Emma McGow, Associate Professor in the Department of Animal Science, have been working together on projects involving cover crops, polycrop blends, shoulder season grazing, and extended grazing. There is no such thing as a normal year, says McGow. She points out that while you can't control the weather, having a diversified feeding strategy and relationships built with others in your area can help when plans need to be changed. Both researchers note that it is important to have a plan going into the grazing season, but it is just as important to have a plan B and be flexible if the weather throws a wrench in those circumstances. You have risk management strategies and conditions you count on, but you have to be able to pivot if Mother Nature gives you a different set of conditions, says Lawley. All of these systems can help with risk management, says McGow, whether it is grazing cover crops, grazing stubble or crop residue, salvaging a failed commodity crop, or any other method of integrating livestock and crops. Having these systems helps provide some safety in case of drought or other climate disasters. When talking to producers about adding cover crops or management practices to extend the grazing season, the two concerns Lawley and McGow hear are that practices can be high risk and high cost. While these can be prohibitive, McGow recommends trying practices out on a small scale first to see what will work in your area and on your operation. Can you seed just a 20-acre plot to see if something will grow or manage only a small segment of your cattle a certain way rather than put all of your eggs in one basket? She asks. Even within their research trials, Lawley and McGow have had to make adjustments due to the weather. Over the years, between drought, flooding, and hail, they have had to accommodate differences in seeding dates, changing grazing timelines, salvage crops that were intended for harvest, and even use some crops in different seasons than intended. While this can be frustrating, it also provides real-world examples of how different systems may be used on farms and how sometimes that can have unexpected benefits. For example, due to weather conditions in 2023, they were late seeding on annual forage plot in July. However, that crop ended up greener and more lush than earlier seeded plots. Lawley says, "You can think of us as a bit of a case study for producers who are out there trying to do this. I provide the agronomy knowledge and Emma provides the animal experience." The research team points out that communication has been vital to working together, as both come to the table with different knowledge, goals, and expectations. Lawley explains, "It's about building that safe space to have a really clear dialogue where we can discuss how the agronomy affects the feed value and vice versa." Key things to remember if thinking of salvaging a crop or grazing cropland for other reasons include: keep lines of communication open, be willing to seek advice from professionals and others who have used similar systems, have a backup plan, try new crops or mixtures on a small scale first, match the class of cattle with the feed available, feed test, and ask about any withdrawal dates for products used on crops. Turning cattle out onto cropland can be beneficial as it can return nutrients to the soil, but there are concerns about the compaction and uneven nutrient distribution. While many soil scientists are looking to quantify the costs and benefits of having cattle on cropland, Lawley points out that being strategic about what crop you plan to grow the following year can help mitigate the risk. She says, from a crop perspective, you are going in knowing that you may have to do some residue management or choose a crop that can thrive or at least cope with that. If grazing a crop with a lot of residue, such as corn, you may want to consider a crop that has been seeded later in the following season to allow that residue to dry out. Working with an agronomist can help you plan what to seed next in the rotation. Depending on your fertility strategy, you may choose to seed something like a cereal after grazing annual cropland that could take advantage of the readily available nitrogen. Alternatively, you may choose a nitrogen-fixing pulse crop that doesn't need nitrogen early in the season to allow time for the microbes to break down the nitrogen in time to mineralize and be available for the crop next year. If planning on using cropland for winter feed, it is necessary to think of how the crops themselves will respond to winter weather conditions and grazing. If cattle will be harvesting plants themselves in winter and snow, the crop's ability to be accessible under snow needs to be evaluated. Considerations such as plant structure and leaf loss and retention late in the growing season are very important for extended grazing. Another thing to be aware of is the infrastructure required. When turning cattle out on cropland, fencing and water availability need to be considered. Do the logistics of setting up grazing pay off, or would it be more economical to bale or silage the feed and move the feed to the cattle rather than the other way around? If extending the grazing season is a long-term goal on your operation, it may pay to invest in infrastructure like electric fencing or portable water systems to build these materials up over time. Grazing cattle and crops together can be a win-win solution for both crop and cattle farmers with proper communication and the willingness to try new things and be adaptable to change.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now